Okay. Hi. And at this point, I don't feel the slightest hesitant to say that I am very happy to welcome Lisa back to the stage. So on Monday, she explained how we construct our emotions. Yesterday, she explained how we construct our minds. And today, in the gripping finale to this trilogy, we're going to hear how we also construct reality. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, so here we've made it to the final lecture. And for those of you who are returning, thank you so much for hanging in there with me. And for those of you who this is your first lecture, I've gone easy on everyone so far. This is the most provocative lecture. A couple of things to say about this lecture. First of all, it's necessarily incomplete in the sense that we only have an hour. I'm probably going to run slightly over an hour. But there's a lot of, background auxiliary assumptions and evidence and so on that it can't do in an hour for such a big topic like what is the nature of reality. So hopefully some of that will come out in the questions. The second thing to say is this is the second time I've given this talk, and I rewrote it from the first time. And I'm not a philosopher by training. So this is a psychologist and neuroscientist attempt to say something philosophically relevant. And so here we go. If you're perceiving me, if you're constructing anxiety, we're in synchrony there. So in lecture 1, we discussed the idea that signals from the world and from the body have no inherent psychological meaning. They become meaningful when they interact with the signals in your brain. And I referred to this as relational meaning. In this lecture, I'm going to take the idea further, and I'm going to suggest that everything in reality, everything real, exists only in relation to something else. And that something else includes you. This is called relational realism. And I hope to convince you that relational realism is a reasonable metaphysics based on the way that your brain works, using some ideas and evidence that we discussed in lecture 2 that we'll build on today. So let's start with what relational realism is not. I am not suggesting that reality exists only in your head. It's not idealism. I am not suggesting that there are many realities that are all equally true. I am also not suggesting that the only part of reality that we know is the part that we can sense or experience. And I'm not suggesting, as many people do in the predictive processing tradition, that there is an objective reality out there that is independent of you, but that you can only know it filtered through in a biased way that is filtered through the veil of your own beliefs. Instead, what I'm going to suggest is that there is one reality that is inherently perspective dependent, and it's flexible, but not infinitely flexible, right? There are constraints. And to be really clear, and I'm sure this is going to come up, I am not saying experience creates reality. I am saying that there are signals out there that create reality only when they interact with signals in here. Your signals, the signals that constitute your brain and your body. And what I've done is I've segmented the lecture into 3 parts that build on each other successively. And the first part is really to discuss, and the first part, what we'll discuss is signals. We're going to talk about signals and how they interact with one another to create reality. And I'm not talking about, your reality and my reality. I'm talking about bona fide reality here. The formal definition of a signal is simply any quantity that varies in time and space. This is an engineering definition. It's a neutral definition. I really like this definition. Some familiar signals that we've already talked about are the wavelengths of light that hit the retina of each of your eyes, the vibrations that move the fluid in your inner ear and tickle the little hairs of your cochlea, the action potentials of a neuron, the concentration of cortisol in your blood, the movements. I think my jacket's hitting the mic, so I'm just going to take it off. The movements of muscles and so on. But there are other signals. Really anything can be understood as a signal, right? The display, the time display on a clock, the fluctuation of interest rates. Any of these things can be thought of as signals. And note here, I'm not using the word signal to mean meaningful information, which is the opposite of noise. Signal just means any quantity of anything that varies. And it could be information or it could be noise. So any quantity that varies. A signal by itself has no inherent meaning, like the signals from lecture 2 where I showed you the blobby image before we saw the color photograph. The psychologist William James described signals by themselves as a blooming, buzzing confusion. But when signals interact with one another, there's a different story. They constrain one another, and from that constraint, new levels of organization emerge. So that blooming, buzzing confusion becomes predictable moments of organization that have meaning. An example of meaning is literally any object in the world that you live in. What philosophers call entities, and what physicists call the classical world. And what I'm describing here is the relational view of quantum mechanics from the physicist Carlo Rovelli. And if you haven't read his book, Helgoland, I strongly suggest, if this is a topic that's of interest to you, which I'm assuming it is because you're here, you take a look at that book. It's a really brilliant distillation of his relational view of quantum mechanics, and helped me, I'm not a physicist, but it helped me then actually try to read the actual technical papers. The idea that signals constrain each other when to create meaning is also called contextual coherence. So, for example, an electron is not a particle and it's not a wave. It's an interaction among signals, a momentary interaction among signals, and so is the chair that you're sitting on, and so is the room that we're in. Except for some of these signal interactions, the moment lasts much longer than for others, obviously, you know, because we're all still in this room together, and the room hasn't changed in a way that we can detect. So signal interactions exist on various time scales, and due to our biology, we experience some of these interactions as a constant, i.e. the events in the objects of the classical world. So the claim from the relational view of quantum mechanics is that every object in the classical world is an event formed from interacting signals. Your brain and every other part of your body are also events that are formed from interacting signals. And even your thoughts and feelings and actions are events that are formed from interacting signals. And I don't have a lot of time for digressions, unfortunately, because I have so much to say. But what I want to say is that, you know, we think of a neuron, for example, as an object, right? It's a little cell. But actually, that cell, what makes up that cell are a lot of signals. Like, for example, an action potential can be decomposed into you know, potassium pumps, sodium pumps, you know, changes in concentration across gradients and things. So things that we think of as, I'm not saying things can be reduced, I'm saying everything which seems to us to have a corporeal, physical nature really can be thought of as an event of interacting signals. Every instance of every category is an event formed from interacting signals. So going forward, we should think of instances of categories not as entities, you know, but as events formed from interacting signals. Now, this is hard because I find it hard because a relational view asks us to deny a very simple, basic assumption about the nature of reality. So what I'm going to do is take you through the logic step by step, contrasting relational realism with traditional realism, which brings us to the second part of the talk. And in this part of the talk, we're going to talk about the color red. So conventionally, red is a feature of objects. Common sense tells us that red is a fixed inherent property that exists outside of us in some objective reality that is merely detected by our human retinas. In philosophy, this outlook is known as realism, but I'm going to call it traditional realism to distinguish it from relational realism. So traditional realism is the idea of an outside world full of entities with inherent features like red that exist separately from any human. In traditional realism, the assumption is we come to know the features of the world that are independent of us through rational and empirical means. But in relational realism, the view is that red is a feature of the relationship between signals, signals in the periphery and signals in the brain. Certain wavelengths of light are reflected off a flower, for example, along with surrounding light of other wavelengths, and these signal ensembles are transduced, they're detected and transduced by arrays of cones in a neurotypical retina. Those signals from the retina make their way to a neurotypical brain where they interact with other signals, and the result is the experience of red. So red is not a feature of an object called a flower. Red is a feature of interacting signals. Another example would be velocity. If I throw a ball to you, the ball does not have velocity. Velocity is a property of the ball in relation to something else. The ball's velocity is different in relation to me standing here versus in relation to a train going by versus in relation to a bird flying past. Velocity is a property of the relationship between the ball and something else. And red pretty much works the same way. It's a feature of interacting signals. So let's break this down. A neurotypical human retina contains 3 types of cones that work together to produce trichromatic vision, what is called trichromatic vision, hence the rose is red. For animals that lack a particular cone, like this one particular cone, like dogs and bulls and horses and rabbits, the flower is not red. It's a muddy green color, muddy green-brown. Now, common sense suggests that the flower is actually objectively red and that other animals just can't see the red, so they are colorblind. Dogs are colorblind. But relational realism suggests that red is not real for dogs, that reality is perspective dependent, and red is not a feature that is part of that reality for a dog. And I want you to notice something here because it's really important, and it's important for the rest of the talk, and it's going to keep coming up again and again, and that is, if we hold to the view that the flower is objectively red and that other animals just can't see objective reality the way we can, then we are implicitly defining objectivity by what is neurotypical for humans. Based on our best understanding of the neuroscience of color vision, any notion of objective reality has a hidden condition, and that is it secretly depends on what is shared by humans who have typical brains and typical bodies. The signals bouncing around in a neurotypical human retina are required for the existence of red or for any other feature that we see in supposed objective reality. This hidden condition is exactly the same kind of hidden condition in Newtonian equations in classical mechanics, though they have hidden conditions too, such as, objects have to be of a certain size and they have to be close to Earth in a certain way in order for those equations to work. So Newton didn't know about those conditions because from his perspective, from our perspective, they're held constant, so they're just invisible. And hence we had, the innovations of relativity theory and then quantum mechanics. So the hidden condition in traditional realism is that what we call objective reality depends on or is conditional on what is consensual, the consensus amongst neurotypical humans. And again, this is going to be a thread that I'm going to carry through the entire talk. So consider people with non-neurotypical retinas. Some are missing a particular cone, and therefore they experience the flower as green rather than red. Other people have a fourth cone, allowing them to see 100 times the number of colors of someone with a neurotypical retina. Would we say then that the people with fewer cones or extra cones fail to experience the flower objectively, the color of the flower objectively? If your answer is yes, then you are accepting the assumption that objectivity depends on consensus among typical brains. If you reject this assumption, then you would conclude that reality created relationally necessarily depends on the number of cones in your retina. And you'd be relinquishing the cherished idea that all humans inhabit one single objective reality with one single set of features. Because if neurotypical retinas had 4 cones and having 3 cones was rare, that flower would not be considered objectively red. It would be objectively some other color. And reality, as it pertains to humans, would be different. You with me? Okay. So far we've only talked about cones in your retina. What about the signals in the rest of the brain that are necessary for creating red? And I say the rest of the brain because the retina actually is also part of the brain. Well, in lecture 2, we established that your brain makes an embodied category for red. Remember this example? Yep. The top light appears red here, even though the filter blocks out all the wavelengths of light that a neurotypical human would see as red with neurotypical cones. This example illustrates that some of the signals that are necessary for seeing red are only in your brain, if your brain can make a concept for red. So red is relationally real. It's a feature of the signals, of signals in relation to one another, and some of those signals are necessarily in your brain. Now, what would happen if your brain could not assemble an embodied category for red? Well, take a look at this guy. This person is a member of the Dani tribe of Papua New Guinea. The Dani have neurotypical retinas, but they only have 2 embodied color categories, Mola and Mili. Mola is the category that includes what for us would be warm, bright colors like red and yellow and white. And Mili is the category for cool, dark colors like green and blue and black. So for the Dani, the petals reflecting light at around 650 nanometers are not red, they are Mola, whereas the stem and the leaves are Mili. A person who makes the categories Mola and Mili will act on this flower according to those categories. So the wavelengths of light that are Mola belong to the same category, meaning they are similar enough to be treated as equivalent or interchangeable for some function. So a person who makes the category mola will act on those wavelengths as if they're equivalent, in the same way that an average English speaker would not make distinctions between types of red or types of blue that, say, Russians see as very, very, very distinct, as distinctive categories. Now, common sense tells us, because our brains automatically have been wired and automatically make an embodied concept or category for red, to us it seems like the petals are objectively red and the stem is objectively green, and the Dani just can't see that objective reality. But that, my claim to you today, is that that is naive realism. And it's a special kind of naive realism, and we call it ethnocentrism. Right? It's just like there are these cases when people arrived in Ellis Island in the United States, which was where immigrants arrived, and they were given various tests, and one of the tests was whether or not they could read English. And they couldn't read English. If they couldn't read English, they were considered illiterate. It's exactly the same idea here. So red is not an enduring feature of an object. It's a feature of interacting signals. It's an event. Red is relationally real. And so is every other feature that emerges from events of interacting signals. The feature delicious is not lurking inside foods like dark chocolate and French fries and crusty bread. Feel free to insert whatever your favorite foods are. It's a feature of the relations between the molecules in those foods, the signals within your body, like signals from the bacteria in your gut and signals flying up the vagus nerve, signals from your taste buds, signals from your olfactory bulb, the actual status of glucose metabolism in your body, as well as the signal ensembles in your brain. And likewise, paintings are not inherently beautiful, money is not inherently valuable, jokes are not inherently funny, snakes are not, except mine are inherently funny. Everybody else is totally relative. Snakes are not inherently threatening. People who cut you off on the highway are not inherently assholes, even though it totally feels like that in the moment. Thank you. One person is obeying the rules here. Come on, people. Beauty, value, humor, threat, these are not inherent features of objects in the world. They are not causal processes in the human mind. You don't have a threat detector where you are evaluating threat. All of these features are features of relations that your brain is making, is constructing. So they don't exist in the world. They exist in relation between what is going on in your brain and the signals that your brain is receiving from the world and from your body, the inside of your body. And so this brings us to our third topic, which is categorization. Right? Because categorization is the way that brains create these features, these mental features. And so we're going to return to the topic of categorization. So when we talk about reality, we should probably just stop for a second and ask ourselves, like, what exactly are we talking about here? We're talking about the world of signals outside our heads, right? In lecture 2, we discussed how the world depends in part on the signals in your brain. And so that's what we're going to unpack. Today, what I'm going to tell you, I'm going to suggest, is that your brain constructs physical features of reality, what we think of as concrete features of reality, like red, and the social features of reality, like value, threat, anger, happiness, in much the same way, in fact, in exactly the same way, by category construction and categorization. And to explain this, we need to dive into the architecture of the brain. We have to just revisit it for a couple of minutes. And today we're only going to focus on the architecture of the cerebral cortex. So I get to show you that one slide that I spent an hour working on. I knew it would be useful. Once we understand how the brain implements a category as a momentary event of interacting signals, so I'm talking here about ad hoc categories of the sort that Larry Barcelo discovered and has written a tremendous amount about. Once we understand how a brain constructs ad hoc categories as events, as signal events, we'll appreciate the power of consensus amongst humans to create reality. So we're going to return to the allostatic brain system that I showed you in lecture 2. And to remind you, this is a flat map of the parts of that system which appear in the cerebral cortex. So if you'll remember, this one hemisphere of the cerebral cortex is like a balloon. And so we popped the balloon and we laid it flat. And the black part in the middle is where the subcortical areas would be. And the part of the system, the parts that belong to the system are the parts in red and in yellow and in orange. Now, the cerebral cortex is made of many, many types of neurons of all different shapes and sizes arranged in layers. So if I were to pop your cerebral cortex off one of your hemispheres and stretch it out like a napkin, we could see that the neurons and other cells, they're arranged in layers. To simplify matters here, we're only going to concern ourselves with one kind of neuron, which is kind of shaped like a pyramid, hence its name, pyramidal neuron. And I'm just going to give you the gist. So we're just talking about the 20,000 meter summary here. There is an anatomical gradient in the cerebral cortex that looks something like this. At one end, the end I've depicted in black, there are very large neurons with lots of connections. These neurons, they send and receive many, many, many signals. So in these parts of the brain, and don't worry about what the little, I mean, I can tell you what they are, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. This is the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. This is entorhinal cortex. This is primary olfactory bulb. In these parts of the brain, there are fewer neurons, but they're really big, and they have a lot of connections. At the other end of this gradient, and this is an architectural gradient, right? It's an anatomical gradient. This is depicted in white. At the other end of this gradient are tiny little neurons with very few connections. And these tiny little neurons code for tiny little concrete details like edges and tones and so on. The receptive fields of these neurons are super small. So we're talking here about primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, primary somatosensory cortex. And there's a gradient in between. Now, the big neurons, psychologically, we describe them as coding for abstract features or representing abstract features. Where's my friend who asked me? Is my friend here today who asked me about Evan Thompson? Are you here today? No, he's not here. Phew. Okay. Well, anyways, we're using R with a representation with a little r, right? We're not talking about strong representation here, representational theories. But basically, the neurons in white are coding for tiny little details that we think of as concrete. And these are coding for features that we think of as abstract. Like threat and value, anger, happiness, and so on. And traffic runs in both directions simultaneously along this gradient. So let's start with the neurons, the tiny little neurons here depicted in white. As their signals flow across that anatomical gradient, their spatial and temporal redundancies are removed. This is called compression. It's signal compression, like an MP3. Not that it matters for this discussion, but it's lossy compression. Actually, it might matter. So it's lossy compression, meaning as the redundancies are compressed away, they're gone. They're not recorded anywhere. They're not retrievable. This compression gradient produces multimodal summaries in the big neurons. So I want you to notice what this means for anyone who's interested in the debate about whether cognition is embodied or not. The best neuroscience evidence that I'm aware of suggests that abstract features are not amodal. They're not without modality. They are summaries. They are multimodal summaries. They still carry signals from all the modalities, but they're summaries with redundancies compressed away. Abstraction means that that many different sensory and motor particulars, concrete details, map to the same function. So you can shout in anger, cry in anger, laugh in anger. Your blood pressure can go up in anger. It can go down in anger. It can stay the same in anger. The sensory and motor particulars of each instance are different, but in a specific situation, these varied signal ensembles are equivalent as anger because they serve the same function. They share an abstract feature. There is so let's think about what the brain is doing when it's constructing, or what the cortex is doing when it's constructing a category. The signals begin in the black areas, those areas that have the biggest, most connected pyramidal neurons. These are what we discussed. These are limbic in their architecture. And when they issue prediction signals or the beginnings of a category, the first thing they do is they send allostatic control signals down through the midbrain and the brainstem to the spinal cord. And we're not going to really talk about this today, but there is a decompression gradient that is in the subcortical parts of the brain, so that by the time, so these are basically, you could think of these as having action concepts in a sense, and this decompression gradient here is creating options for more and more options for visceromotor particulars, meaning the exact movements that will cause your heart rate to increase or decrease, or whatever the signal, whatever the neurons are predicting. At the same time, those same signals, the axons from those neurons, are actually also sending signals across that gradient to the sensory periphery. And we think of these as sensory prediction signals. So the signals are being decompressed. Now, if you remember what I said, the compression is lossy. So that means when things go in the other direction and you go from an abstract summary to details, the brain has to guess at what the details, the sensory details are, which means that what's happening here has been described by cognitive scientists as perceptual inference or simulation. So a single pattern of multimodal abstract features can become any number of multiple patterns of sensory and motor particulars that are available to make sense of incoming sensory data as it arrives to the cortex, conferring flexibility. And while this decompression is happening, I should say yes. And so these multiple sensory motor particulars are like possible futures. They're possible futures of sensory particulars, right? So threat can have, in a given situation, can have many different manifestations as a set of sensory signals, and the brain is prepared to receive those signals. At the same time, signals are flowing in the other direction, and we talked about those yesterday as being prediction error signals that are being compressed in the presence of the sensory predictions. So this is category construction, and this is learning. Now, remember that we talked about how a category is you know, a set of instances which are similar in some way. And what the brain is doing is it's remembering. When it creates a category, it begins to category construction, or it's creating a set of prediction signals. It's remembering instances, bits and pieces from the past, and that are similar in some way to the present. So which features is it using to create the predictions? If it's only using the multimodal features, you risk catastrophic overgeneralization. Because think about all the times in your life that you've ever felt pleasure, or all the times in your life when you've ever felt threatened. There are a lot of sensory patterns there, right? That your brain would be attempting to bring to bear to make a prediction about this instance here. So that's, you know, what happens in depression, basically. On the other hand, if you were only using the concrete sensory features here, that would mean that you were trying to search your memory for a particular instance in the past that matched the present in its sensory features, like lines and edges and so on. That, I think, describes a brain that's on the spectrum, not like a neurodiverse brain. So either the brain is using some combination of features at different levels of compression, or it's using, you know, some mid-level of compression. But I think actually based on what we understand about the hippocampus and the importance of the hippocampus, which we haven't talked about here because there isn't really time, I'll just tell you. My hypothesis is that the brain is using all these features at various levels of compression to remember as it's generating a category. And hopefully this will become, this little foray into anatomy, it will become clear to you why this is important. We can summarize all of these details like this. Abstract features like pleasure, like threat, like value, like happiness. These are multimodal summaries whose sensory and motor particulars have been compressed away to create functional similarities in a specific situation. This is what it means to learn a category or a concept. So any multimodal summary, like say a summary for happiness, the summary happiness, the feature happiness, is an ensemble of electrochemical signals that correspond to more than one high-dimensional ensemble of concrete sensory and motor details like these. They are different in how they look and how they feel, but they all share the same abstract feature. So abstraction lets us experience things in terms of their function, not just in terms of their physical form. And when the brain is predicting, a single multimodal feature can become any one of multiple sensory and motor particulars that are available to make sense of incoming sensory signals. Now, when a brain can decompress a multimodal feature, an abstract feature, into a variety of partial probabilistic patterns, we say that the brain has the concept or has the category or is generating the category or is constructing the category, knows the category. Abstraction also is how the same event of interacting signals takes on different relational meanings depending on the rest of the situations. So lying on the beach can be an instance of happiness when you're on vacation, or it could be an instance of anxiety when work is piling up in your absence. And the same is true for a racing heart. It's true for every other signal that we've talked about so far. Now, the capacity, I'm here now paraphrasing the developmental psychologist Susan Gelman, who writes, and this is a paraphrase, this is my paraphrase, that the capacity to experience a concrete world of physical features in terms of non-observables, abstractions, is a hallmark of the human mind. It's one of the great capacities of the human mind, or the human brain. And what I'll just say here is that abstraction, let me say it differently, compression is not unique to a human brain. Like that compression gradient that I showed you is in every vertebrate brain. It's in every mammalian brain. It's in every primate brain. It's just we have bigger brains. Barb Finley, who's the evolutionary biologist, talks about there are no new parts in your brain, right? We haven't evolved new parts. The cerebral cortex, it's not new. Every mammal has cells that are the cells that make up the cerebral cortex. What's different about our brain is that, actually I should just say, our cerebral cortex, yours and mine, are not even large for a primate. It's exactly about the size it should be for a primate of our size. But it's big. And there's more room for more abstraction than there is, say, in a chimpanzee brain. So if you look at a human brain and you look at where the expansion of tissue has occurred, it's partly in the parts of the cerebral cortex that are involved in this compression. The compression gradient's just larger. So if I were summarizing, I would say a chimpanzee, can understand that a monkey climbing a tree and a panther climbing a tree and a snake climbing a tree are all similar, part of the similar category to climb, even though the sensory and motor particulars might be different, or for the chimp looking at these different animals climbing the tree. But what a chimp can't do is understand the similarity, the functional similarity of those instances to climbing a social ladder. Even though they have a social dominance hierarchy, they're not using that abstraction. They have some capacity to do abstraction, but not to the same extent. On the other hand, they have when they remember something, when their brains reinstate an instance, they can remember details, really fine-grained details, like we would call them episodic details, which works for them because they have to forage for food. So when I tell you that chimpanzees can't abstract the way humans can, I'm not saying that with any great degree of pride. I'm saying that they can do, a chimpanzee would never lose their keys. They would never misplace their keys, right? They would always know where their keys were. Their abilities are coordinated with their ecological niche, as is ours, as I'm going to show you in a minute. So far, we've been talking about relational meaning in terms of one human brain, right? The ability of the brain to take signals from the sensory surfaces of the body and combine them with its own electrochemical signals to create a moment of relational meaning. But when multiple human brains are in consensus about the relational meaning they make, about the abstractions they make, something special happens. Like-minded humans can make stuff up that becomes real, becomes part of reality, by compressing away sensory and motor particulars in the same way to create abstract features and consensus. A group of humans can impose new functions on signal events that the signal events don't have by their physical nature alone. And this imposition of new functions is called social reality. Many parts of our everyday lives that we take as given are actually aspects of social reality. So if I say to you, I'm feeling really anxious right now, anxious, that's a word, 2 phonemes, 2 features, which stand in for a whole set of features that are going on in my brain right now. And when I say I'm anxious, that conjures in you some set of features. Maybe not all the features, but probably some degree of overlap if we are communicating with each other. So very, very efficient. It's very efficient to have, this is a function of social reality. Language is a very efficient way to communicate, in part because we have the capacity to make the same abstract features. But when I'm in a restaurant and I ask someone where the washroom is, which is what you say in Canada, in the United States, nobody knows what you're talking about. And here, if I say restroom, sometimes people know, but toilet is not something you would ever say in the United States, right? This might seem trivial to you, but it's not trivial. This is actually the basis of social reality. So social reality is when people change the function of a hunk of metal from a vehicle to a dwelling. Social reality is when humans in Iceland decide that rotting flesh from sharks is food, while people in India, a group of people in India, decide that the muscle from a healthy cow is not food. No matter what abstract features humans make and add to reality, we can never decide that ground glass is a nutritious meal, because there are embodiment constraints, right? We can't just make any shit up and make it real. But we can make a lot of shit up, and if we agree on it and we give it a name, it becomes real. I actually have given entire lectures on this single point, with lots of really fun examples, but not today, my friends, not today. Today we're sticking with the philosophy, the hardcore stuff. Signals in human brains and bodies in consensus contribute to reality. The fact that objective reality has this hidden condition, that it's conditioned on hidden consensus among humans, means that what we think of as physical reality, red, emerges from the same process as social reality. They're both caused by the same, or they emerge from the same process, and in fact you could just think of them as the same. All neurotypical humans develop the architecture to make abstract features. So the architecture is there at birth, and it's tuned and it's pruned in particular ways, but it's there at birth. It's part of the brain plant for building a vertebrate brain. But which abstract features a human learns to make depends on experience. So let me say it differently. I'm screwing up the delivery here. Sorry. A newborn brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a brain that has that architecture, but it's waiting for wiring instructions. Where does it get wiring instructions from? The world. The world here includes the baby's own body, right? So baby's not born, isn't born being able to see over the first couple of months of life. The signals that hit the retina wire primary visual cortex to have a map of the retina. Your map of your retinas in V1 is related, dependent on the exact distance between the 2 eyes in your skull. Just like your hearing is wired to the shape of your ear. If we magically took, your brain and put it into somebody else's skull, that person, you in that other body, would not be able to see, because your brain is wired to your body. It's also wired by the other parts of the world, the social parts of the world that where people act towards you, they speak to you, they feed you, they maintain allostasis for you. So each of us learns how and when to treat different context, specific sensory and motor patterns as functionally equivalent. And this learning is transmitted from generation to generation during development via the processes that scientists call socialization or cultural inheritance. It's very similar to what happens when you move to another country. If you move to another country where they speak another language or they have a system of concepts which are different from yours, you have to learn them. You have to learn those categories. You have to learn how to make those abstract features, when to make those abstract features. That's called acculturation. And if you're not familiar with the work on emotional acculturation by Batya Mesquita, I would highly recommend that you have a look at her work. It's brilliant. It takes the ideas of what I'm talking about here and manifests them in looking at cultural variation in emotion. So the words and actions of other people, along with the conditions inside your own body, create signal events, patterns that recur, allowing for statistical learning. And these patterns wire in your brain with the capacity to generate functional similarities amongst concrete signal ensembles that differ in a way that matches or is congruent with the natural and cultural ecology of your environment. Meaning that a single flexible human brain architecture can make a variety of human minds. Not an infinite number of minds, mind you, but definitely more than one. And when people make different categories, reality is different for them. So there is one human reality, but it is perspective dependent. I'm not saying that, one person's experience of reality is, different from another person's experience of reality. I'm talking about bona fide reality here. So to summarize, reality is relational. It's a complex web of variable interacting signals that momentarily constrain one another, producing events of relational meaning. The signals that make up reality have statistical regularities, but those regularities are not out there in the world in some human independent way to be detected. Your brain is part of those regularities. The signals that seem regular to you are regular because you have the kind of sensory surfaces that you have. So you are part of the signal ensembles that you are detecting. They are conditioned on the signals that make up you. And some of those signals we all share if we're neurotypical, like we all have 3 kinds of cones. But some of those, and all humans make abstract concepts, all neurotypical humans. But the exact ones we make, when we're making them, the generalities that we're deriving, are not always the same. A perceiver-independent reality that pertains to us does not really exist in a meaningful sense because there's this hidden condition of consensus. Categorization is at the core of relational reality. When you act, you're categorizing. When you perceive, you're categorizing. When you remember, you're categorizing. Even a change in feeling or a decision or when you're imagining is constructing a category. Even a change in heart rate or a change in inflammatory chemicals or vomiting all can be thought of as a kind of categorization. In the West, we usually think of action, perception, memory, emotion as categories of separate psychological events. But what I'm suggesting today is that they're just different abstract features in a common process. They're constructed during an instance of categorization. And so in that compression gradient, you can think of, you know, red is a category. It's a category of different wavelengths of light that you treat as similar. But red is also a feature of a category it's a feature. It's a category, but it's also a feature of categories that are more abstract, that where the similarities are more multimodal. And so, really, any feature you could think of as a category or as a feature. But here I'm focusing on features that the brain is constructing and thinking about the category as the entire ensemble of signals in the brain. This explanation is very simplified, but it captures the notion that categories don't exist as enduring universal groupings of objective entities with inherent features that are out there in the world, separate from us, waiting to be detected. Categorizing in this sense is not detecting regularities, it's creating or constructing regularities by virtue of the signals that make us up. Constructing categories as unfolding signal events to reduce metabolically expensive uncertainty. So this is what relational meaning is. It is creating reality for humans. Category construction constrains the meaning of incoming sensory signals from the sensory surfaces of the body. So the sensory signals, there are signals out there. Just the fact that we have certain sensory surfaces, that constrains which signals we can detect. And then our nervous systems are basically compressing those signals further as part of category construction. So this renders a signal event meaningful from a particular perspective in terms of a particular function. Now, in relational realism, experience is beside the point. I'm not making the claim that you have to experience something for it to be real. I'm not saying you have to be aware of something for it to be real. I'm saying the key point is that signals become reality for humans if they interact with some signal in your corporeal body, either registered by a sensory surface, or your brain has to be able to make the signal, or in science we've invented fancy technology that translates one signal that we don't have sensors for into signals that we do have sensors for. You know, just like dark matter. When someone discovered what they call dark matter, that was a moment of reality expansion for us. How do we know that the signal is there when we can't detect it? Because we're detecting a dysregularity in other signals we can't detect. And that tells us something is there, even though we don't have sensors for it yet. I mean, technology. So other quantities other signals that we can't detect are irrelevant to us because they don't affect us. They're not in our ecological niche. They're not part of the environment that affects us in any way. So I'm wrapping up now. That was the summary. I just want to leave you with one final thought. It's common sense, as I've said, to assume that objects like this flower exist in the world, in reality separate from us. That's traditional realism. You know, we can pick a flower, we can buy a flower, we sometimes eat flowers. Common sense tells us that we group flowers together by their nature in reality, not by our particular goals or interests or concepts or what have you. A flower is a flower because it exists in the world as a flower. That's traditional realism. But to an ant, what for us is a flower is simply terrain to climb on. And for a whale, the flower is probably invisible. It's irrelevant. It's not in the animal's ecological niche. And to an imaginary creature of subatomic size, a flower would be mostly empty space. And I think this is a justifiable example. I mean, philosophers are always talking about zombies. So I think this is a reasonable thought experiment. To claim that an event of interacting signals is inherently a flower is a perspective that this is inherently a flower in a perspective independent reality is an inherently value-laden judgment because it elevates one type of organism and their biology over others. You know, to claim that there is a single human nature with a single set of categories endowed by evolution is to inherently elevate one perspective in a reality dependent world. It elevates one perspective over others. It's a value-laden judgment. Now, if we had more time today, I would read you a passage from a book, a history of psychology book by Kurt Danziger. This is a book that he wrote in 1997 called Naming the Mind. And in this book, the opening chapter is just brilliant. He's talking about a time when he went to Indonesia on sabbatical to teach psychology. And he gets there and he finds out that there's already a course in psychology being taught, indigenous to the country. So he thinks, oh, you know what would be really cool is if he got together with that instructor and they talked about how, contrasted and compared how, you know, cognitions, emotions, motivations, perceptions, how they're understood in different cultures. So he meets with his counterpart and he finds out those categories are completely meaningless to that culture. That is not how they understand human nature. That is not how they categorize. And it's, you know, they come to an understanding that they can't align their categories, basically, even using conceptual combination. And I just, if we had more time, I would read it for you, but I would encourage you to go have a look, because what Danziger does really beautifully is demonstrates relational realism for the mind. And so with that, I will thank you for your attention.
Can you turn them on? They're on. So do we have any questions today?
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is about, so could you tell me more about what I think is like, so what happens if you apply your theory to your own theory? So it seems like there seems to be in traditional or objective reality about the brain functions, like how we construct our concepts, like category creation, how they're bull signals, or how they're like anatomical features of our brain, or how you discover data from like billions of papers. It seems like you're discovering something objective. Then
I would never say that, but sure.
Yeah, and then one of the implications I thought is that your theory might be called a neurotypical theory of emotions and mind and reality, because even though you might observe the brains from neurodiverse people, I feel like the scientists could be the majority of people are neurotypical. Therefore, the theory could be produced by neurotypical people, and it could be called a neurotypical theory of emotions, mind, and reality. So, like, another way of putting it is, so if the scientists were neurodivergent, do you think the reality that you observed from the data could have been different?
Well, sure. I mean, I could give you a completely different spin on the experiments that I talked about. I mean, I want to say a couple of things. One is that there is a necessary, you know, there's a necessary sort of dependence I can't avoid, which is that I'm using evidence that is theory laden to, like all experiments are theory laden. So I'm using theory laden experiments that create evidence to create observations, and then I'm inferring something from them. There's a circularity there I can't escape. No scientist can escape. But what a scientist can do is be aware of the fact that the experiments are theory laden. And they can actually use a different theory that would make very different assumptions to try to create observations. Like, what is an experiment? An experiment is just you're creating experiences for yourself as a scientist that you're going to compare against your hypotheses. So I think there is a way to be careful about it. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that when I first started retraining as a neuroscientist, one of the things that really confused me was when you look at the brain, like, how do you know if one neuron is synapsing on another neuron? How do you know? Are they part of the same circuit? Is it one circuit modulating another circuit? Like, where are the lines? Like, how do you know? And the answer is you don't. You never know. The scientist decides what's inside the system and what's an input to the system and what's an output to the system. So I could decide that the cerebral cortex is a system. I could decide the whole brain is a system. I could decide the whole nervous system is a system. I could decide you and I right now are a system. I could decide we're all... The point is that this is called scientific pluralism, right? That you can use different perspectives to constrain the meaning of your data or interpret the meaning of your data. And there's a really interesting kind of argument from feminist philosophers who are arguing for something called standpoint philosophy, which is to say, in science, there is no objective fact. What stands in for objectivity is consensus. Consensus amongst scientists who are diverse in their backgrounds, diverse in their assumptions, and they exist in a self-questioning, self-critical community. So I would say that is, in terms of a philosophy of science, or in terms of the philosophy of doing science, that's sort of how we do it. That's how I do it in my lab. That's how we do it. Do I think that a neurotypical scientist would come up with the same ideas as I, or the same interpretation? I don't think most scientists agree with this interpretation. And I would say that probably neurodiverse scientists probably would have diverse interpretations too. Like, I don't think you could talk about what the average neurodiverse scientist would do because people are different. But I think what I can tell you is I've had lots of emails from lots of neurodiverse people who feel like this makes a lot of sense to them. And actually, they feel validated by it. They're not scientists, at least they don't describe themselves to me that way. What they describe is feeling understood. Because inherently, I mean, I keep hammering away at neurotypicality because that's what that's a sort of, there's a set of assumptions being made that nobody's really talking about. The one last thing I'll say is that even neurotypicality is an abstraction that is not real. It's a simplification. Actually, every person's brain is slightly different. Like, the plan is very similar. In fact, the plan for all mammals is very similar. It's even similar amongst many vertebrates. But the details, the devil is in the details. And one of the things our lab is known for is attempting to study individual people over time in a deep way, and not study fictions like abstractions, like averages of people, which I did for many, many years because that's what I was required to do. So I totally hear you, and I agree with what you're saying in general principles, but I do think that you know, you can't get away from the circularity, but you can be mindful of it, and you can also use pluralistic approaches to your benefit as a scientist. I think that's my opinion. Anyways. Mm-hmm.
Hi.
No.
Hi, Lisa. I'm
Where
over
are
here.
you?
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for this. This is great. I'm a philosopher of perception, so I've got lots of things I could ask about. But I thought I'd kind of. I guess my question is really kind of what we're left with, what the big picture is here. So, and in particular, I suppose whether relational reality is on your view the only reality. And I suppose the question. So what we have is we start with signals, right? We have these signals. Now you can imagine a world in which evolution worked a little bit differently and brains never existed, but the signals would still be there, right? So that looks like there's something to talk about there, some kind of reality, which is, I suppose you could say, the kind of reality which physics is interested in, right? Physics is interested in looking at the world from from the view from nowhere, from some kind of perspective which isn't actually inhabited by somebody.
Yeah. So I would say, go have a look at The Blind Spot by Evan Thompson and Marcella Glaser, and I can't remember the other, Alan somebody, there's a third physicist. What they talk about really beautifully is that this view from nowhere is a complete abstraction simplification, that it isn't real. And in fact, not only, I mean, I will say, if you haven't read Nancy Cartwright, you should, because she talks a lot about, like, for example, scientific laws are fictions. They are fictions that we create so that they're general, right? The periodic table, a fiction. You can't actually use the periodic table. So you have to add detail back in context. So my point to you is that, physicists create abstractions, but I would say those abstractions are not real. They are fictions by design. They're simplifications by design so that we can make generalizations. But that doesn't make them real. So I think, Carlo Rovelli, I probably cite him most because I think I understand him. I mean, I've been trying to understand physics since 12th grade. Like, I just inherently don't get it. But he kind of makes sense to me. One of the things he said, which really resonated to me when he was explaining Schrodinger's, the Schrodinger cat paradox is, like, why would the world care that there's an observer? Like, why would nature care? And the answer is nature doesn't care. It's the way that we're asking the question that's the problem. So do I admit that there are signal interactions out there that we can't detect? Maybe, yeah. In principle, sure. But is that part of reality for a human? Not until you detect it. Not until there's some way for you to interact with it. Yeah. And of course, one way to think about science is the goal is to try to expand reality as opposed to understand reality. So sometimes when people, like the other day, somebody asked me, well, the brain has to, construct a three-dimensional world. And I was like, no, the brain doesn't have to do that. It does that. And that works for us. But evolution didn't require that that's the way it works. We have certain sensory surfaces, and this is the solution that, evolution delivered. But in principle, it could have delivered others. It just didn't. So that doesn't mean that those are necessary, that there's some necessary requirement there to perceive things in a particular way because they're real out there without us. I don't know if this is making any sense.
Yeah, I think it is. It is. I guess I think it's a big move from talking about reality to talking about reality for humans or reality for a perspective.
Well, one of the really interesting things, I'm not going to lay claim to this because, for me, this is a philosophy of science ultimately. For me, this whole journey, I was trying to figure out, honestly, why why would scientists who have particular goals to understand how the world is continue to use methods that we've known for 40 years are flawed and like substantially flawed and artifactually construct results? Like, why would that happen? And the answer can't be because you know, they're careerists or whatever. Like, I thought there has to be something else at stake here. So for me, it was trying to figure out really my journey as a scientist for 30 years. I feel like I've been swimming against the stream, and I want to understand why. But in this book, The Blind Spot, they're making a very, very important set of claims. They're saying that believing in the abstraction, that the idea that there's a God's eye view or a view from nowhere actually has led to very serious problems, not only in the way that science is conducted and used, but in our relationship with the Earth. So they're making very strong claims about climate change and about, like, if you view reality, you view the world as not inherently related to you, but just out there for your purposes to manipulate objectively, that leads you to it has led to a whole set of consequences that now we have to grapple with. So I'm saying you should go have a look at that work, because to me, that was a set of consequences I had never actually considered before, which to me, it makes a lot of sense. And I think they've argued it really beautifully, but you'll have to see what you think.
Hey, Lisa. Thank you so much for this. I'm over here. I found this very engaging. And I really liked what you said about this. We cannot make anything up and make it real, but we can make a lot of shit real. So in light of this, I'm wondering if you could say something about how we can go about to construct a reality that is serving to us, both individually and collectively, and how can we do that to the best of our abilities?
Well, that's not a scientist question. So you're asking me, well, okay, so I'll just say a couple of things. One is that I think what this whole journey has taught me, and I'm not like finished with the journey, right? I'm still on it. And if I talk to you in 10 years from now, if I'm still alive in 10 years, I don't even know that I'm going to say the same thing, right? Like when I talk about emotion now, I'm not saying the same thing as I said 25 years ago. That's why you have to read things in historical context, right? But I think it's taught me a couple of things. One is to be curious instead of being confident. This is very hard, actually. Scientists are supposed to be curious, but curiosity is, I don't think I'm the only one who, sometimes struggles with being curious when something violates a deeply held belief. But I think that it is reasonable. And I actually find it easier in science than I do with my daughter, I'll just say. Like, right, when she was a teenager, it was really hard to actually, perspective take, put myself in her shoes. It sounds trite, but I actually think it's something people don't do very often. Maybe some people do it more than others, but I think everybody struggles with it. And I think it is possible in life and also in science that more than one theoretical framework can work productively, right? But mostly I would say to be curious and to remember that. So if you and I are friends, let's say, and we're having coffee, and I say to you, well, I was so anxious at the beginning of that talk, and you say, no, you weren't. You were argumentative. Who's right? That's not an answerable question, because the reality is I experienced things one way and you experienced them a different way. And that's what's real right there. And that's what we have to work from. If you do that, you probably won't get divorced. And you probably keep your friends for a really long time. right? You're not always asking who's right, who's right, who's right. I think the other thing I'll say is that, and, you know, this is really going out on a limb, but, you know, I'm already out there, so why not pile on a little bit more? You know, prediction error, things we don't expect that we have to learn, that's an added metabolic expense. So if you're already encumbered metabolically by tremendous uncertainty in your life because of economic uncertainty or because of climate change, or if you live in the United States, you never know when the next, you know, school shooting is going to be, or because of climate change, you know, there are slight increases in carbon dioxide levels, which actually make it harder for your brain to regulate your body, or, you know, because you haven't slept enough or whatever. You're more likely, you know, automatically to look for ways to cut costs. And one way to cut costs is to only expose yourself to people who are like-minded, who are like you, who think like you. You can, if you make yourself predictable to them, they're really predictable to you, and everybody benefits metabolically. But there's a problem with that, and that is that then you come to believe the hidden condition, right? You come to believe that consensus is objective. It tells you something objective instead of just that it's a consensus. So those are some of the ways I actually use these ideas in my life as a scientist and as a mother. Although I think if you talk to my daughter, she might say, yeah, now maybe, but like not when she was 16.
Thank you very much for interesting.
Sorry, I don't know what's polite now. If I should. Okay, but thank you very much. I found that both very stimulating and compelling. And I guess I was wondering a bit about the comparison with non-human animals. And when you were talking about the brain, and brain size seemed to be an hypothesis about, you know, why abstraction?
Oh, that was just one little thing off the top of my head. I wasn't making.
But I was just wanting to explore a different kind of thing that you were talking about at the end that I might think is a crucial part of the story, which is cultural inheritance and language as a sort of bootstrapping mechanism for a lot of this consensus and coordination that we achieve, and it doesn't, and that we somehow do know that doesn't exist at the same level in many. I mean, cultural inheritance, of course, exists in some primates and in some other mammals as well. But I mean, it seems like language and other forms of cultural inheritance must play a huge role in how we seem to think of reality as non-relational somehow.
A huge role. So like I said at the beginning, this is necessarily incomplete. We only have this brief amount of time together. Yeah, there's like a huge story there, a huge story about the way in which by our actions and our words, we are basically transmitting across generations categories and concepts and wiring in them into the brains of the next generation, who then go forward and do the same. And you know, sometimes people will say, well, you know, so are you saying it's nature or nurture or what? You know, and I'm like, well, we have the kind of nature that requires nurture. You know, we have the kind of biology that offloads a lot of the transmission of meaning to culture because it's very efficient. And we published a paper. So I was very fortunate to work with a neuroscientist who was really interested in our allostatic care of infants as the basis for cultural inheritance of concepts, of language, right? So the idea there is that infants are born unable to regulate themselves allostatically. They don't even know how to nurse. You have to teach an infant how to do that. They require caregivers to maintain allostasis for them, and over time, I don't know if you're a mother. When I was a mother, I mean, I am a mother, but when I was a mother of an infant, I didn't think of myself as wiring her brain with every word I spoke, whether I held her on my back or in my front or in a, stroller. I mean, like, I just didn't think of it that way, but that's actually what was happening. That's what happens. And so I talked a little bit about statistical learning, but really, and I'm saying this with a small r, everything is reinforcement learning. Like, what is reward? Reward is just related to allostasis, basically. Anything which is maintaining or promotes allostasis is going to be rewarding. So really what you're doing, you become this really, as a caregiver, you become this very potent, salient reinforcer. And what you're reinforcing, you don't know it, is the acquisition of categories and concepts. And the thing I want to say about this, because I think it's super important, is that infants are amazing. Like, they can learn abstract concepts at the age of 3 months, right? There are these really brilliant experiments by Lisa Oakes and by Susan Gelman and by Sandy Waxman in particular, right? So she'll do experiments like this. She'll say she has for 3 months olds, they'll use any sound from a primate, a hoot or a word, in the way that I'm about to describe it. But from 4 months on, it's just words spoken by humans. And because we're talking about tiny little babies, it's very deliberate. It's like supervised learning. So I look at you, you're the baby, and I say, "Look, sweetie, this is a bling." And I put the bling down, and it beeps. And then I say, "Look, sweetie, this is a bling." And maybe it feels different, and it looks different, and I put it down, and it beeps. And then I say, "Look, sweetie, this is a bling." Does the baby expect this to beep? Yes, they do. So they've used the word. The word is now the feature that predicts the beeping. And babies do this at 4 months of age, reliably to words. What's really interesting is that most of at least in the West, I think this is probably generally true. Like, we label trucks for our children, we label animals for our children. We do some supervised learning, but most of the learning that they do is unsupervised, right? Where they're hearing words and they are using words automatically. And I'll just give you this one anecdote, and it doesn't prove anything, but I found it like shocking. So how old was Sophia when this happened? Maybe 6 months, 7 months? We were sitting at dinner. So we're sitting at dinner, literally actually like this, and she's here in a high chair. And I'm saying something to Dan about the oven, which is behind me. And I say something about the oven, and she looks at the oven, and we were like, okay, wait, what, really? So then we just looked at each other, locked eyes, and then we started mentioning parts of the kitchen. And she just was turning around and looking at things, and we were like, holy shit. So sure, do we know that, receptive vocabulary precedes, productive? Yeah, sure, we do. But what's happening is words, and I don't actually understand why words are special. And I don't know that they seem special, but they are, different developmentalists talk about them in different ways, but they do seem to work for, they work as abstract features to invite the formation of imposing functional similarities on things which are sensorially and motorically different. So absolutely, 100%. Can I just also say something about your question? I just want to go back to your question. Sorry, sir, yeah, I just wanted to say one thing I was thinking about. I'm actually deeply uncomfortable with the idea that reality is, I mean, I have moments where I really struggle with myself and say, is this really what I want to say? Do I really want to say this? So I just wanted to sort of add that it's not like I'm blithely going along and saying, you know, I think I think of it as the natural extension of what I'm saying scientifically, but I'm not like 100% sure. And I'm sort of, it feels like wrong in a way. Scientists aren't supposed to talk like that. So I just wanted to add that piece. Like, I'm not blithely disregarding everything that everybody says. I just keep trying to poke holes in my own. I don't want to be inconsistent with myself unless I mean deliberately to contradict something that I've said before. And I think that this view is consistent with what I've said so far, but I'm not completely copacetic with it, if you understand me. I just, not that that's relevant, but I just wanted to share that with you. Yeah.
Shavin?
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and to my mind, it really was similar to Kantian view about reality. And Alvin Plantinga has this interesting paper that he says, according to Kant, reality is based on the noetic activity of our brain. And the example he gives is that, like, the fact that dinosaurs roamed around on Earth is actually dependent on us. So, like, what makes it true is the noetic activity of our brain. So I wanted to ask, how much do you think that your views is similar to Kantian view? But this is not the important question. The important question for me...
Great way to slip in two questions with one. That's
yeah, but
like,
I wanted to ask a question yesterday.
Yeah.
And the important question is that what it takes for people to live different realities. Like, there is this paper by Rorty, I guess, and he says that we understand the world based on conceptual schemes. And we can like have conversation and like have a shared understanding of the world based on this conceptual scheme. But our concepts change through time. And like, for example, 20,000 years from now, there can be humans with completely different conceptual schemes, which means they live another reality, completely different from us. But an implication of this would be that people from now cannot interact with people in 20,000 years. There is no way of understanding each other. And this is what makes the implication of living a different reality. But
you have to stop now, because you just asked me like 5 questions.
Okay.
Yeah. So... No, go ahead and finish. I was just kidding. You can, if you want.
No, and I wanted to say, like, is
but
it
my
the
working
fact
memory
that
is full. I just
is it the fact that I, for example, cannot see some colors makes it the case that I live in a different reality, or the living in a different reality is as radical as what, for example, Rorty says, that we cannot understand?
Well, let me try to pick those off, not necessarily in any order, although we'll leave Kant till last. I think, first of all, this idea that if you don't have this, if you can't make the same concept as somebody else, that you can't share a reality, well, that ignores conceptual combination. I mean, first of all, well, then maybe I'll say this in a different order. I don't know, I haven't read Rorty, but I can say conceptual schemes and things like that, I think, ignore the fact that categories are events. They're events. You don't have a category stored in your head like a file that you pull up from a file drawer. Every time you use a category, you're making it on the fly as you need it. The only thing that's the same about every instance of anger that I make, every category that I make, is that they all have the word anger, really. And there are no appraisals, there are no bodily sensation. There's nothing really in the literature, even functions. Anger serves different functions in different situations. So I think the idea that categories are not entities, they are events. And the category that you make of anger today in this situation is going to be different in some way, probably, from the one that you make, or at least on a gradient, or at least there's a distribution of them. So that's the first thing. But the second point is that every neurotypical brain can do conceptual combination. This is not my research, but this is from cognitive science. There's a whole literature on conceptual combination, which just means you take bits and pieces of the past and you combine them in new ways. I may not have exactly the same, I may not have been acculturated to a particular category, but I to some extent can make an approximation. And just how good that approximation is determined by how well we understand each other in a conversation. If you are acculturated, if you have the capacity to make that category, people acculturate. Their conceptualizations change with exposure to new experiences. So I have to imagine that. So I just don't buy the, if we come from different worlds, we can't share the same reality. Of course we can. That being said, I think, I'm not a historian, but I think historians are very clear. Are there any historians here? So historians back me up here, or tell me if I'm wrong. Historians, I think, are very clear that you should not assume that the concepts that you have, the categories you use, are exactly the same as the ones that you're reading about from 400 years ago or 800 years. Am I wrong? No, you're right. Yeah, even if the words are the same. And very big mistakes get made when people do that. It's, I believe, called presentism. Is that presentism? Like interpreting the past in line with, yeah. So, okay, good, thanks. I did not pay her, and we actually don't know each other, right? So I think, and so the same is true for the, right? So, yes, I completely agree. I mean, I think you have to take context into account, and that's true whether you're talking, to your kid or your professor or your friend, or you're reading a book from 400 years ago, or you're somebody's reading you 2,000 years from now, assuming we haven't all blown ourselves up by then. Which brings me to Kant. I am not a philosopher. I have to tell you that I felt like I just wrote a piece on philosophy of science that took me 2 years to write. And I mean, I'm not even going to go into it. It took me 2 years to write. And I basically bought myself an entire library in the process. I feel like I just completed a very shallow PhD that was self-supervised on a very narrow slice. Kant is a punishment to have to read. Like, I don't know how else to say it. There are some people like William James. You read William James, he's so, I mean, not if you read his radical empiricism essays. Those are really hard to read. But, I mean, Kant is like Piaget, or Gibson. I mean, like, just like, I find him really hard to read. And I will admit that a lot of what I understand about Kant is from secondary sources that I'm going back and forth between, his original words and how other people have interpreted him. So I think there was a time when I would have said, no, what Kant is really saying, there is an objective world out there. There are primary, like Locke's primary features, but we can only access that reality through our concepts. And some of those concepts are inborn, but others aren't. But still, there's a real there. We can only access it through our concepts, and so, or view it through our concepts. And so, I would have said, well, not really. But then, a couple of months ago, I gave the Rudolf Carnap lectures in Ruhr, Germany, at Ruhr University, and I met Tobias Schlicht, who is an expert in Kant, who tells me that that is not that there's some considerable debate about whether that's really what Kant said, and he was trying to explain to me, and I'm not sure I completely understand. So, but I guess my answer to you is I would like to know the answer to your question too. I don't currently know. Because I don't know how to, I don't know enough about philosophy at that time, that what he was responding to. You know, I just know the highlights like everybody else. I don't have a deep knowledge of it, so I don't really know. Yeah.
Yes. There are a few more questions, but we're running short on time.
I know, I'm
No,
really
so I'm wondering, Peter, do you have a shortish question? Can you make it short? So that this is the final question.
Well, he might be able to make it short. I don't know.
You hear me? Yeah. The title of your talk was Relational Realism. I think a better title would be Relativistic Realism. I mean, looking at red being context dependent, I have no problem with that. But I was a bit surprised to hear you bringing in the Dani and Amola and Millie. And it sounded to me as if you were saying that they see the world differently because they only have two color words. And that would be what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But they have no problems in seeing differences between red and yellow and so on, just as any non-Russian speaker has no problem in seeing differences between light blue and dark blue. So my question is, how far does your relativism go?
Yes. Well, first of all, I will say that relativism is not a dirty word. It's the opposite of relativism is absolutism, I'll just say. Okay, so that's actually not my point. Other philosophers have made that point, so I'm just stealing at that point. So I think absolutism is a pretty big problem. So I don't really see relativism as a problem. But what I will say is the following. There's work by, you know what, I knew someone was going to ask me this question, and I wrote down the work that I want to tell you about. And so there is research by Angela Brown and Dalwyn Lindsay at Ohio State University. And they have done a lot of research on cross-cultural color perception. And what they find is that people within a culture, so when you look at, so you are very correct to pin that, ask me about that question. People within a culture, when scientists talk about the people of a culture and what categories color categories they have, they're talking about on average in general. But people within a culture vary in the granularity of their color categories. The issue isn't whether they can see the differences between this wavelength of light and that wavelength of light. The issue is when they're acting in the world, do they treat them as the same or equivalent or not? That's the issue. And it turns out that within a culture, people vary in the granularity of their color categories, just like people vary in the granularity of their emotion categories. And so on average, first of all, the Dani have two color categories, but that doesn't mean every person in that culture has two. And there are some people in some cultures that are characterized by more categories where they are largely responding as if there are two. I can see the difference between lots of different wavelengths if you just ask me if they're similar or different. But that doesn't mean that in the real world I would act on them in a way that treats them as different. And in fact, if you can become an expert, when you become an expert in color, you know, because you're an artist or an interior designer or whatever, you start to functionally treat different sets of wavelengths, treat different groupings of wavelengths as you tend to, you get more granular in your categories so that you are always stumping me with these like hard questions that take me many, many words to answer. You're making more categories, which means that you're treating the wavelengths more groupings as distinct. You're functionally acting on them as distinct. That was the point that I'm trying to make. And I will point out also that these people, Angela Brown and Delwyn Lindsay, now have evidence, although they didn't interpret it this way, but when they gave a talk at, they gave a colloquium at Northeastern, I asked them this question. They now have evidence that you yourself, they have evidence that people are constructing color categories in the moment, because there are inconsistencies in how people categorize a given wavelength using not Munsell color chips, but like something similar on a computer. So there's less reliability in your own categorization of what you're treating as similar in a given moment, depending on what you've just seen or what have you. So I guess I would say, yeah, that was a abstraction, that was a summary, but I still stand by the point that sometimes that's all you need are two categories, and for whatever is functional, whatever you're functionally doing in the moment.
I think that's a perfect point to stop.
Sure.
And I would just like to introduce head of the philosophy department, Martin Jönsson, for a few final words.
Maybe start off by another round of applause for.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for 3 terrific lectures.
Thank you.
They've been iconoclastic and thought-provoking throughout. They've also been very accessible, so the consequences of your thesis can be felt not only in cognitive science, but also among the philosophers here and among the people representing other disciplines in this quite diverse crowd that you've attracted. So, as a token of appreciation from the philosophy department, I'd like to present you with the commemorative Pufendorf Medal. Applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for your willingness to engage with this material. I really appreciate it. Thank you.